Late afternoon. June 26, 1943. Somewhere over occupied France near Forges-les-Eaux. Lieutenant Robert Johnson sits in the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt, watching a formation of B-17 bombers turn for home. They've just finished bombing Villacoublay airfield near Paris. The mission is almost over. Johnson is 23 years old. He's been in combat for 2 months. One confirmed kill to his name, scored 13 days ago over the Netherlands. Today, he's about to discover whether the airplane beneath him can actually keep him alive when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The P-47 Thunderbolt. The largest single-engine fighter ever built by any nation. 10,000 pounds empty. 17,500 pounds fully loaded. Powered by a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine. Armed with 850 caliber Browning machine guns. Fast in a straight line. Deadly at high altitude. Absolutely brutal in a dive. But the P-47 has one significant problem. One weakness that's been costing American pilots their lives since the airplane entered combat 3 months ago. It can't turn with German fighters. The Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109 are lighter. More agile. They can execute tight horizontal turns that the massive Thunderbolt simply can't match. In a sustained turning fight at medium altitude, the P-47 is at a disadvantage. Against experienced German pilots, that disadvantage can be fatal. American doctrine is clear: Thunderbolt pilots should never turn with German fighters. Never try to outmaneuver them. Use speed. Use altitude. Dive in, shoot, climb out. Hit and run. Don't get caught in a turning fight. Johnson has been trying to follow that doctrine since his first combat mission on April 18th. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. The German pilots are experienced. They understand how to bait American pilots into unfavorable positions. They know the Thunderbolt's weaknesses. The 8th Air Force has been losing P-47 pilots since March. The learning curve is steep. The cost is measured in young lives. Johnson has watched pilots die. Good men. They climbed into their Thunderbolts believing in their training and came back in boxes. Or didn't come back at all. The official reports often say, pilot error. The instructors say these pilots weren't following doctrine properly. But the pilots who survive know the truth. Combat is messier than doctrine. The enemy doesn't cooperate with American tactical plans. Sometimes you get caught in a turning fight whether you want one or not. At 19,000 feet, 48 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group are spread across the sky in loose formation. They're providing top cover for the returning bombers. Johnson is flying tail end Charlie. The last position in his squadron's formation. The most vulnerable spot. The position newer pilots often get assigned. He scans the sky above and behind, looking for the dark specks that mean German fighters diving from altitude. The afternoon sun is low in the west. Hard to see. Perfect ambush position. Then he sees them. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from the second group of Fighter Wing 26. Diving from 25,000 feet. Coming from the sun. Coming fast. Johnson keys his radio. Tries to warn his flight leader. Before he can complete the transmission, the first Focke-Wulf opens fire. 20mm cannon shells rip through Johnson's P-47. The canopy shatters. Glass and plexiglass fragments fill the cockpit. Hydraulic fluid sprays across his face, burning his eyes. A 7.92mm machine gun bullet nicks his nose. Destroys his oxygen mask. Another bullet hits his right leg. The round splits in half as it enters, just under the skin. Fire erupts in the cockpit. The P-47 snaps into an inverted spin. Johnson can't see through the hydraulic fluid. Can't breathe without his oxygen mask at 19,000 feet. Can't control the aircraft with the hydraulic system destroyed. The massive fighter tumbles through the sky like a brick thrown from a building. He tries to bail out. Wedges his feet against the cockpit frame. Pulls on the canopy with both hands. The canopy won't budge. The hydraulic system that normally slides it back is completely destroyed. He's trapped in a burning, spinning fighter with no way out. The fire in the cockpit burns hotter. Metal groans under stress. The engine screams at overspeed. Johnson thinks about his wife Barbara back in the United States. He resigns himself to death. He stops fighting. Waits for impact. Then somehow the fire goes out. Starved of oxygen at high speed in the spin, it simply extinguishes itself. Johnson kicks left rudder. Pulls back on the stick. The P-47's nose comes up. The spin stops. He's flying level at 8,000 feet. Half blind from hydraulic fluid. Bleeding from his nose and leg. No hydraulic pressure. No oxygen. No way to know how badly damaged his aircraft actually is. He points the battered fighter toward England and shoves the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney engine, despite everything, is still running. Still producing power. That's when he sees the Focke-Wulf pull up alongside him. The German pilot flies formation on Johnson's left wing. Close enough that Johnson can see him clearly through his oil-smeared canopy. The German looks at the shredded American fighter. Looks at Johnson. The German pilot appears surprised the Thunderbolt is still flying. Then the German positions himself behind Johnson and opens fire again. Hundreds of 7.92mm machine gun bullets hammer into Johnson's P-47. The German has expended his 20mm cannon ammunition on the initial attack. All he has left are the two cowl-mounted machine guns. But at close range, even machine guns are deadly. Johnson hunches behind his armored seat back. The only protection he has left. The noise is unbearable. Metal screaming. Bullets punching through aluminum. The smell of cordite and burning oil fills the cockpit. He can hear rounds hitting all around him. Hitting the wings. The fuselage. The tail. The German pilot flies alongside again. Looks at Johnson. Shakes his head as if in disbelief. Then lines up for another pass. This time the German uses a technique called spraying. He works his rudder back and forth while firing, walking his bullets from wingtip to wingtip across Johnson's aircraft. It's a method designed to ensure hits on every vital system. Nothing should survive this kind of concentrated fire. Johnson's P-47 shudders under the onslaught. More holes appear in the wings. In the fuselage. In the tail section. The aircraft should have come apart. Any normal fighter would have disintegrated under this punishment. Should have fallen from the sky in pieces. It keeps flying. The German makes 3 more passes. Each time he empties his guns into the Thunderbolt. Each time Johnson expects the wing to fold or the tail to separate or the engine to quit or a fuel tank to explode. The P-47 absorbs the punishment and continues toward England. The big Pratt & Whitney radial engine keeps running. The wings stay attached. The control surfaces still respond to Johnson's inputs even without hydraulics. Finally, after the 5th attack run, the German runs out of ammunition. He pulls up alongside Johnson one last time. Rocks his wings. A gesture of respect from one pilot to another. An acknowledgement of the Thunderbolt's incredible toughness and Johnson's courage. Then he turns back toward France. Johnson nurses the crippled P-47 across the English Channel. He has no landing gear hydraulics. No flaps. No radio. His vision is still blurred from hydraulic fluid in his eyes. His leg is bleeding through his flight suit. His face is burned from the cockpit fire. He finds RAF Manston, a forward operating base on the English coast used for emergency landings. Lines up on the grass beside the runway. Cuts the engine. And bellies the Thunderbolt in without gear. The P-47 slides across the grass for 200 yards, throwing up dirt and grass, before grinding to a stop. Ground crew run to the aircraft. They have to pry Johnson out of the cockpit. His hands are locked on the stick. His legs won't move. The adrenaline is wearing off. Shock is setting in. Johnson tries to count the bullet holes in his aircraft. He gives up after 200. And that's just one side of the fuselage. The ground crew finds 21 20mm cannon holes and more than 200 machine gun strikes. Every surface is damaged. The aircraft is a total loss. But it had gotten Johnson home alive. What neither Johnson nor anyone else realizes in that moment is that this one incident will become legendary. It will prove something about the P-47 Thunderbolt that changes how American pilots think about their aircraft. The thing is, the first pilot Robert Johnson saw die in combat was Lieutenant Roger Dyer. Same day. Same mission. Same enemy attack by Fighter Wing 26. The 56th Fighter Group lost 5 aircraft that day. 4 pilots were killed. Roger Dyer was one of them. Shot down over France. He never made it home. Dyer had been in Johnson's training class back in the United States. They trained together at Bridgeport Municipal Airport in Connecticut starting in July 1942. Those training days had been harrowing for everyone involved. The 56th Fighter Group received the first production P-47B Thunderbolts in June 1942. Nobody had operational experience with the aircraft. The pilots were essentially test pilots and trainers simultaneously. The learning curve at Bridgeport was steep and deadly. The airfield was inadequate for an aircraft the size of the Thunderbolt. The runway was too short. The approaches were difficult. The P-47B model had teething problems that hadn't been resolved. Engines failed. Control systems malfunctioned. Pilots made mistakes learning to handle an aircraft unlike anything they'd flown before. Between June and December 1942, the 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots killed in training accidents. 41 aircraft were destroyed. Robert Johnson later wrote that many of those accidents were directly attributable to the inadequate facilities at Bridgeport and Stratford. The men weren't dying because they were poor pilots. They were dying because they were learning to fly an experimental fighter at an inadequate airfield under intense pressure to become combat ready as quickly as possible. Roger Dyer survived that training period. He was one of the more naturally gifted pilots. On November 13, 1942, Dyer and Lieutenant Harold Comstock pushed their P-47s into near-vertical dives from 35,000 feet. Both pilots' controls locked up from compressibility effects as they approached 700 miles per hour. The aircraft began to buffet violently. The sticks were frozen in place. Both pilots thought they were going to die. Comstock kicked the rudder and fought the stick until the aircraft broke out of the compressibility zone and the controls freed up. He pulled out at low altitude, shaking from adrenaline. Dyer had the same experience. Both survived. Republic Aviation issued a press release claiming the pilots had exceeded the speed of sound. The story was picked up by newspapers across the country. Some aviation reporters drew it in Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoons. The claim was almost certainly false. The P-47 probably reached around Mach 0.85 or 0.9, not Mach 1. The compressibility effects were severe, but the sound barrier remained unbroken. General Hap Arnold sent a telegram to the 56th ordering that there would be no more discussion of the dive. The Army Air Forces didn't want wild claims about supersonic flight muddying the waters. But the incident showed something important about Dyer. He was willing to push the aircraft to its absolute limits. He was aggressive. Fearless. Perhaps to a fault. That aggression served him well in training. It got him through the deadly learning period at Bridgeport when so many others died. Now, 7 months later, Dyer was dead at 24 years old. Shot down in the same battle where Johnson survived. The difference between life and death came down to seconds. And luck. And the incredible structural toughness of the Thunderbolt. Johnson's aircraft absorbed the punishment and kept flying. Dyer's aircraft didn't. Maybe Dyer took a cannon hit in the engine that Johnson didn't. Maybe Dyer's aircraft was hit in a fuel tank. Maybe the German pilot who got Dyer was slightly better positioned or slightly more experienced than the one who attacked Johnson. Combat was random. Survival often came down to factors beyond a pilot's control. Johnson got lucky. Dyer didn't. By mid-July 1943, the 56th Fighter Group has lost pilots in almost every major mission. The statistics are sobering. Young men arrive in England fresh from training, fly a handful of missions, and die. The aircraft performs well in some situations and struggles in others. The doctrine of hit and run works against inexperienced German pilots, but fails against veterans who understand how to negate the Thunderbolt's advantages. The problem isn't simple. The P-47 has real disadvantages that can't be ignored. At altitudes below 20,000 feet, where most combat is occurring, the Messerschmitt Bf 109G and Focke-Wulf 190A can outturn the Thunderbolt. They can outclimb it at medium altitudes. They're more responsive in pitch and roll at speeds below 300 miles per hour. In a swirling, low-altitude dogfight, the German fighters have significant advantages. But the P-47 also has real advantages that many pilots aren't exploiting. The turbocharged Pratt and Whitney engine maintains power to much higher altitudes than German engines. Above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt is faster than anything Germany has. It can dive faster than any German fighter without coming apart structurally. It can survive damage that would destroy a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. It has 8 50 caliber machine guns versus the German standard of 1 cannon and 2 machine guns, giving it superior firepower in the brief moments when guns are on target. The question is how to fight in ways that emphasize American advantages while minimizing German advantages. That requires tactical innovation at the unit level. Pilots and flight leaders experimenting with techniques. Sharing what works. Discarding what doesn't. Learning through experience. Which means learning through casualties. The worst part is the morning ritual. Every day at dawn, pilots walk to the flight line. They perform pre-flight checks on their assigned aircraft. They watch ground crews fuel and arm the P-47s. They listen to briefings about the day's mission. They study maps showing the route into Germany and back. They look at intelligence reports about expected German fighter strength. Then they climb into cockpits and take off toward Germany, knowing some of them won't return. Some come back. Some don't. The randomness is psychologically brutal. The ones who come back often report that the P-47 feels heavy in hard turns. Like there's resistance in the controls. Like the airplane is fighting them when they need maximum performance. Most pilots think that's just the nature of a heavy fighter. Big engine, big airframe, big control surfaces. Some resistance is expected. The P-47 weighs nearly twice as much as a Messerschmitt 109. Physics dictates that it can't maneuver like a lighter aircraft. But a few experienced pilots start to wonder if the aircraft can be flown more effectively. If there are techniques that could overcome its limitations. If American advantages could be maximized through smarter tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, is one of those pilots who questions conventional wisdom. Zemke is 30 years old in 1943. Older than most fighter pilots. He'd been in the Army Air Corps since 1936. He has more flight experience than almost anyone in the European theater. More importantly, he has combat observation experience. In 1940, before America entered the war, Zemke had been sent to England as an observer with the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. He'd watched British and German fighters duel over southern England. He'd seen tactics evolve in real time. He'd learned that doctrine written in peacetime doesn't always survive contact with the enemy. The side that adapts faster usually wins. Zemke brings that perspective to the 56th. He doesn't just follow the tactical manual. He encourages his pilots to think, to experiment, to share what they learn. He creates an environment where innovation is rewarded rather than punished. Starting in late July, Zemke begins gathering his most experienced pilots for debriefing sessions after every major mission. Not just the standard combat report forms. Actual discussions. What worked today? What didn't? Why did Lieutenant Smith get a kill while Lieutenant Jones got shot at? What did Smith do differently? Can we teach that technique to everyone? The conversations reveal patterns. The most successful Thunderbolt pilots aren't the ones who strictly follow hit-and-run doctrine. They're the ones who use the doctrine as a starting point but adapt based on circumstances. They start every engagement from altitude. They dive to build speed. But they don't immediately run after one pass. They use the Thunderbolt's power to stay in the fight longer, making multiple passes from different angles, keeping their speed up, climbing back to altitude between attacks. The less successful pilots, the ones who get shot down or come home without kills, tend to be rigidly following the doctrine. One pass and run. But that gives them limited opportunities to score. And if they get bounced during their escape climb, they're vulnerable because they've given up their initiative. Zemke synthesizes these lessons into guidance for the group. Not rigid rules, but principles. Maintain altitude advantage whenever possible. Use dive speed for the initial attack, but don't be afraid to stay in the fight if you can maintain your energy state. Trust the Thunderbolt's power. Use the engine. Keep your speed up. If you lose your speed, you lose your advantage, so disengage and climb back to altitude. It's subtle. The official doctrine doesn't change, but the interpretation of that doctrine becomes more flexible, more adaptive. The results start to show up in the combat reports. On August 10, 1943, Captain Gerald Johnson is promoted and given command of a flight in the 61st Fighter Squadron. Johnson is an experienced pilot with several kills to his credit already. He's exactly the kind of aggressive, thinking pilot that Zemke wants leading formations. Over the next few weeks, Gerald Johnson and other flight leaders start demonstrating what the P-47 can do when flown aggressively. They stay in fights longer. They use the Thunderbolt's power to reverse situations that should have been hopeless. They climb when they should have dived. They turn when doctrine says to run. And they start getting kills at a higher rate. By September, the 56th Fighter Group's kill ratio is improving noticeably. The group is learning. Pilots are surviving longer. Experience is accumulating. New tactics are being developed through trial and error in actual combat. On October 4, 1943, the 56th flies its first mission to Frankfurt, Germany. The longest escort mission yet attempted by Thunderbolts. It requires careful fuel management and pushes the P-47 to the edge of its combat radius. But the mission succeeds. The bombers hit their targets. The fighters engage German interceptors. The group comes home with multiple kills and acceptable losses. It's proof that the P-47 can do the job it was designed for. Then on October 8, 1943, Robert Johnson scores his fifth confirmed kill. The victim is Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp, commander of Fighter Wing 1. Philipp has 206 aerial victories, most achieved on the Eastern Front against Soviet aircraft. He's one of Germany's top aces. Johnson's flight encounters Philipp's formation near Hardenberg in the Netherlands. The Germans are attacking B-17 bombers near Bremen. Johnson dives on the German formation from altitude. He selects a Focke-Wulf and opens fire. The German fighter explodes. Philipp may have been in that explosion, or he may have been hit by defensive fire from the bombers or by other P-47s in the fight. The exact sequence isn't completely clear from records. What is clear is that Philipp bailed out at extremely low altitude, around 50 meters, and his parachute failed to fully deploy. He died on impact. Johnson doesn't learn until 50 years later that the German pilot he'd killed that day was one of the Luftwaffe's top aces. At the time, it was just another combat mission. Another target destroyed. Another day of survival. But the symbolism is significant. An experienced German ace flying a supposedly superior turning fighter, shot down by an American pilot in a heavy Thunderbolt. It demonstrates that pilot skill and tactics matter more than raw aircraft performance. By late 1943, something fundamental has shifted in the air war over Europe. American pilots are learning faster than German pilots can adapt. The P-47's weaknesses are being minimized through better tactics. Its strengths are being exploited more effectively. The German perspective on this shift is revealing. Luftwaffe combat reports from October and November 1943 show increasing frustration. German pilots note that American Thunderbolt pilots are fighting differently than they had in spring and summer. They're staying in engagements longer. They're using vertical maneuvers more effectively. They're harder to shake off once they commit to an attack. part of the German problem is strategic. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe is being ground down through attrition. They are losing experienced pilots faster than training can replace them. The pilots being shot down are veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The pilots replacing them are often fresh from training with minimal experience. That experience gap shows in combat effectiveness. The Americans have the opposite problem resolved. Their training pipeline in the United States is producing large numbers of adequately trained pilots. These pilots arrive in England, are integrated into experienced squadrons, and learn from veterans before being thrown into the hardest missions. The 56th and other successful groups have developed mentoring systems where new pilots fly as wingmen to experienced flight leaders until they learn the ropes. Additionally, American logistics are superior. When a P-47 is damaged, spare parts are available to repair it. When an engine needs replacement, new engines arrive from the United States within weeks. When a pilot is shot down over friendly territory, he can be returned to his unit within days. The Germans have none of these advantages. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt still can't turn with a Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109 in a level turning fight at low altitude. That hasn't changed. The physics of wing loading and power-to-weight ratio haven't changed. What changed is that American pilots stopped fighting that fight. They refused to fight on German terms. They use altitude. They use dive speed. They use the Thunderbolt's incredible structural strength to pull high-G maneuvers that would tear a German fighter apart. They use the reliable Pratt & Whitney engine to climb back to altitude after every engagement. They use teamwork, wingmen covering each other, making it harder for German pilots to isolate and kill individual Americans. Most importantly, they learn that the P-47 can take damage and keep fighting. That creates a psychological advantage. American pilots know they can absorb hits and still make it home. Robert Johnson had proven that on June 26. Other pilots have similar experiences, getting shot up but making it home because the Thunderbolt is tough enough to survive. That confidence translates into more aggressive tactics. Pilots are willing to press attacks, willing to stay in fights longer because they trust their aircraft to survive. German pilots, conversely, are seeing their supposedly superior fighters being shot down by the brutish American Thunderbolts. The psychological impact is real. Confidence erodes. Caution increases. And caution in fighter combat often leads to defeat. The breakthrough isn't a technological advance. The P-47 that dominates the skies in late 1943 is mechanically identical to the P-47 that struggled in April. Same engine. Same guns. Same airframe. What changed was understanding. American pilots figured out how to fight with the airplane they had. Rather than wishing for a different airplane, they accepted the Thunderbolt's limitations and exploited its strengths. They developed tactics that turned a questioned fighter into a legendary war machine. The 56th Fighter Group became the proof of concept. Flying only P-47s throughout the entire war, the group became the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force. The official Air Force Historical Research Agency credits the 56th with 665.5 confirmed aerial victories. Some sources cite higher numbers, including aircraft destroyed on the ground. But the aerial victory total alone is remarkable. 17 pilots from the 56th became aces. 3 became double aces. Colonel Francis Gabreski scored 28 kills flying Thunderbolts. Robert Johnson scored 27. Major David Schilling scored 22.5. All achieved in the supposedly inferior P-47. The aircraft that pilots had initially called the Jug, sometimes as a derogatory nickname comparing it to a milk jug, became a source of pride. Thunderbolt pilots loved their aircraft. They trusted it. They knew it would bring them home even when shot full of holes. Johnson's survival on June 26 was proof of that. The numbers support the pilots' faith in their aircraft. Of the 15,683 P-47s built during the war, 5,222 were lost to all causes, including combat and accidents. That includes 1,723 losses to non-combat accidents, which was actually a lower accident rate than many other fighter types. The combat loss rate per mission was 0.7%, among the lowest of any American fighter in any theater. The P-47's aerial kill-to-loss ratio was 4.6 to 1, better than the more famous P-51 Mustang in many calculations. Better than the P-38 Lightning. By the numbers, the Thunderbolt was arguably the most successful American fighter aircraft of World War II. But it never received the fame of the Mustang. The P-51 was sleek and beautiful. It looked fast standing still. It had elegant lines and a liquid-cooled engine that appealed to aesthetics. The P-47 looked like a flying milk jug. It was big and brutish and not particularly elegant. The massive radial engine gave it a blunt nose. The thick wings and heavy fuselage made it look slow even when it was fast. The public loved the Mustang. Historians wrote about the Mustang. After the war, when people thought about American fighters in Europe, they thought about P-51s escorting bombers to Berlin. The Thunderbolt pilots didn't care about fame. They knew what their aircraft had done. They knew it had kept them alive when nothing else could have. That mattered more than public perception or historical recognition. Robert Johnson survived the war. He flew 91 combat missions between April 1943 and May 1944. He scored 27 confirmed aerial victories. He returned to the United States in June 1944. He was promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. He received the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medals, a Purple Heart for his wounds on June 26. He went back to Oklahoma, married his high school sweetheart Barbara, had 4 children, worked as a flight instructor for 2 years after the war, then left aviation entirely. Spent the rest of his career in the insurance business. He lived quietly. He didn't seek publicity. He didn't spend his life talking about the war. But he never forgot June 26, 1943. The day his P-47 Thunderbolt took 21 cannon hits and more than 200 machine gun strikes and kept flying. The day he should have died, but didn't. For years, Johnson believed the German pilot who shot him was Lieutenant Colonel Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces. The story became part of the legend. Some accounts even claim Johnson called Meyer's family after the war to express respect for their father's skill and honor. But modern historical research suggests the Egon Meyer attribution is probably incorrect. German combat records show no victory claim filed by Meyer on June 26. The massive radial engine gave it a blunt nose. The thick wings and heavy fuselage made it look slow even when it was fast. The public loved the Mustang. Historians wrote about the Mustang. After the war, when people thought about American fighters in Europe, they thought about P-51s escorting bombers to Berlin. The Thunderbolt pilots didn't care about fame. They knew what their aircraft had done. They knew it had kept them alive when nothing else could have. That mattered more than public perception or historical recognition. Robert Johnson survived the war. He flew 91 combat missions between April 1943 and May 1944. He scored 27 confirmed aerial victories. He returned to the United States in June 1944. He was promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. He received the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medals, a Purple Heart for his wounds on June 26. He went back to Oklahoma, married his high school sweetheart Barbara, had 4 children, worked as a flight instructor for 2 years after the war, then left aviation entirely. Spent the rest of his career in the insurance business. He lived quietly. He didn't seek publicity. He didn't spend his life talking about the war. But he never forgot June 26, 1943. The day his P-47 Thunderbolt took 21 cannon hits and more than 200 machine gun strikes and kept flying. The day he should have died, but didn't. For years, Johnson believed the German pilot who shot him was Lieutenant Colonel Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces. The story became part of the legend. Some accounts even claim Johnson called Meyer's family after the war to express respect for their father's skill and honor. But modern historical research suggests the Egon Meyer attribution is probably incorrect. German combat records show no victory claim filed by Meyer on June 26. His unit was based in a different location. He was actually between commands that day, having just relinquished control of one group and not yet officially assuming command of another. The attack on Johnson was carried out by the 2nd Group of Fighter Wing 26, not Meyer's unit. The truth is that the identity of the German pilot who shot Johnson remains unknown. Aviation historians have searched German archives and found no definitive answer. The pilot who showed Johnson such professional respect, who rocked his wings in salute before departing, remains anonymous. What matters is not the German pilot's name, but what the incident demonstrated. The P-47 Thunderbolt could survive damage that would destroy any other fighter. That wasn't marketing. That wasn't propaganda. That was proven fact, documented in photographs of Johnson's battered aircraft and confirmed by Johnson's own survival. Egon Meyer did achieve remarkable success as a fighter pilot. He scored 102 aerial victories, the first Luftwaffe pilot to achieve 100 kills entirely on the Western Front fighting against American and British aircraft. He was killed in action on March 2, 1944. Shot down near Montmedy, France, possibly by Lieutenant Walter Gresham of the 78th Fighter Squadron flying a P-47 Thunderbolt. Meyer was 26 years old. Lieutenant Colonel Hub Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group and developed many of the tactics that made the Thunderbolt effective, survived the war. He flew 166 combat missions. He scored 17.75 confirmed aerial victories. He was shot down on October 30, 1944. Not by enemy fire, but by weather. Zemke flew into a severe thunderstorm and his aircraft broke apart. He bailed out and became a prisoner of war. He spent the final months of the war at Stalag Luft I. The rugged airframe could absorb ground fire that would destroy lighter aircraft. The 850 caliber machine guns were devastating against soft targets like trucks, trains, and troops. And the Thunderbolt could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or 10 5-inch high-velocity aerial rockets under its wings. From D-Day on June 6, 1944, through the end of the war in Europe on May 8, 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts flew ground attack missions across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. They destroyed thousands of German vehicles, hundreds of locomotives, countless trucks and staff cars. They attacked German troops in the open, German fortifications, German supply dumps, German airfields. The statistics are staggering. In the 11 months from D-Day to V-Day, P-47s destroyed or damaged 9,000 German locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 68,000 trucks, over 6,000 armored vehicles, and thousands of other targets. These weren't just claims. These were confirmed destructions verified by gun camera footage and reconnaissance photographs. The impact on German logistics was crippling. The German army depended on rail transport to move supplies and reinforcements. P-47 attacks on the rail network made daytime rail transport suicidal. The Germans had to move trains at night, which drastically reduced their logistical capacity. Truck convoys couldn't move during the day without being attacked. German units at the front were often short of ammunition, fuel, and food because P-47s had destroyed the supply columns trying to reach them. German soldiers on the ground feared the Thunderbolt more than almost any other weapon. They called them Jabos, short for Jagbomber, fighter bombers. When Jabos appeared, German troops dove for cover. The 850 calibers could shred a truck or a column of infantry in seconds. The bombs and rockets could destroy bunkers and fortified positions. And there was no effective defense except hiding until the attack was over. The cost was high. Ground attack was the most dangerous mission in the air war. Flying low and slow to attack ground targets exposed aircraft to intense anti-aircraft fire. Many Thunderbolt pilots were shot down by German flak while strafing trains or truck convoys. But the Thunderbolt's ruggedness helped. Pilots brought home aircraft with dozens of flak holes, with cylinders shot off engines, with control surfaces partially destroyed. Other fighters wouldn't have made it. The Thunderbolt could. The ground attack mission became the Thunderbolt's defining role in the final year of the war. While Mustangs escorted bombers to Berlin, Thunderbolts ranged across occupied Europe, destroying everything German that moved. It wasn't as glamorous as air combat against enemy fighters. It didn't produce aces. But it won the war. Germany couldn't fight effectively when their logistics were being destroyed faster than they could rebuild. In 1998, Robert Johnson died at age 78. He was buried in River Hill Cemetery, now part of Lake Wylie in South Carolina. His obituary mentioned his service as a fighter pilot in World War II. It mentioned his 27 kills. It mentioned the Distinguished Service Cross. It did not mention June 26, 1943. It did not mention the 200 bullet holes. It did not mention that he'd proven the P-47 Thunderbolt could take punishment that would destroy any other aircraft and still fly home. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, there's a P-47 Thunderbolt on display. It's a D model. Serial number 45 to 49167. Nicknamed 5x5. It's painted to represent the aircraft flown by Colonel Joseph Laughlin, commander of the 362nd Fighter Group. The actual aircraft was built in 1945 at Republic's plant in Indiana and served primarily as a trainer. It was later transferred to the museum and restored by Republic Aviation for the 20th anniversary of the Thunderbolt's first flight. The placard next to the aircraft tells visitors it was one of the most produced American fighters of World War II. 15,683 were built. The aircraft had 8 50 caliber machine guns and could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs. P-47s destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft during the war, more than half in air-to-air combat. What the placard doesn't fully convey is why the Thunderbolt succeeded. It wasn't because of superior design or advanced technology. German fighters were more advanced in many ways. The Focke-Wulf 190D and Messerschmitt 109G were arguably better aircraft on paper. The Thunderbolt succeeded because American pilots learned to fight with the airplane they had. They accepted its limitations. They exploited its strengths. They developed tactics that negated enemy advantages. They stayed aggressive. They stayed confident. They trusted their aircraft to bring them home. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through engineering breakthroughs or technological superiority, though those help, but through pilots and commanders who see what they have, understand its capabilities, and figure out how to use it better than the enemy expects. Through mechanics who kept the engines running and the guns firing. Through training that produced skilled pilots faster than the enemy could replace their losses. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never the most agile fighter. It was never the fastest fighter at low altitude. It was never the best-looking fighter. But it was one of the most effective American fighters of World War II. Not because it was perfect, but because the people who flew it and maintained it made it work. The men of the 56th Fighter Group proved that. Robert Johnson proved that on June 26, 1943, when he brought home an aircraft that had no business still flying. Hubert Zemke proved that through 3 years of combat leadership that turned tactical theory into battlefield practice. Francis Gabreski proved that with 28 kills and the ability to push the Thunderbolt to its limits and survive. Hundreds of other pilots proved it every day by climbing into their Thunderbolts and flying into combat over hostile territory. They flew the jug. They trusted the jug. They came home in the jug. And that's why the P-47 Thunderbolt, despite never achieving the fame of the Mustang, deserves to be remembered as one of the great fighter aircraft of World War II. Not the most famous, but perhaps the most faithful. It brought its pilots home. The P-47's legacy extended beyond World War II. After the war, many countries purchased surplus Thunderbolts. The aircraft served with air forces in Peru, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, China, Iran, Turkey, Portugal, France, and Yugoslavia. Some remained in service into the 1950s and even early 60s in South American air forces. The ruggedness and reliability that made it effective in World War II made it valuable for smaller nations that couldn't afford newer jet fighters. In the United States, the P-47's design influenced post-war aircraft development. Republic Aviation, the company that built the Thunderbolt, went on to design the F-84 Thunderjet, one of the first successful American jet fighters. The F-84 inherited the Thunderbolt's philosophy: big, rugged, heavily armed, emphasizing survivability and firepower over pure maneuverability. That design philosophy continued through the F-105 Thunderchief in the 1960s. The lesson of the Thunderbolt was that there's more than one way to design a successful fighter. You don't have to build the lightest, most maneuverable aircraft. You can build a big, powerful, tough aircraft and make it work through proper tactics and pilot training. That lesson has been relearned multiple times in aviation history. The F-4 Phantom in Vietnam, the F-15 Eagle, the A-10 Warthog, all followed the Thunderbolt's philosophy in different ways. The Thunderbolt also taught the importance of pilot training and tactical development. The aircraft that struggled in April 1943 was mechanically identical to the aircraft that dominated in December 1943. The difference was pilot skill and tactics. That lesson applies beyond aviation. The best equipment in the world is useless without people who know how to use it effectively. Training matters. Experience matters. Leadership matters. The 56th Fighter Group succeeded not just because they had good aircraft, but because they had leaders like Zemke who fostered innovation and learning. There's a photograph somewhere. Robert Johnson standing next to his battered P-47 at RAF Manston. June 26, 1943. The airplane behind him is barely recognizable as an aircraft. Holes everywhere. Metal torn and twisted. The canopy shattered. Wings shredded. Johnson is 23 years old in that photograph. His flight suit is stained with hydraulic fluid and blood. His face shows exhaustion and shock. But he's alive, and the airplane, despite everything, had gotten him home. That photograph tells the whole story of the P-47 Thunderbolt better than any combat report or official history ever could. It shows what the airplane could do. What it was built to do. Not to be graceful or beautiful or elegant, but to bring its pilot home alive, even when that seemed impossible. The fog of war lifts slowly. The engines cool. The guns fall silent. And across the decades, the story remains. Not of the fighter that was supposed to win, but of the fighter that did, not because it was perfect, but because when it mattered most, when the bullets were flying and the odds were impossible and death seemed certain, it refused to quit. The P-47 Thunderbolt. Built like a tank. Flown by men who trusted it with their lives. And it never let them down. The jug brought them home. Not the most famous fight of World War II, but perhaps the most faithful. And in the end, that's what mattered most.